Hey, it's Jared. Let's look at the best video settings that you can use on your Sony ZV-E10 to shoot the best video content with this fantastic little camera. First of all, I'm going to take this windscreen off because I can have better access to buttons, but I definitely use the windscreen on this camera pretty much all the time when shooting outdoors because a lot of times I am moving with this camera. And the angle of the microphone on top of the camera, whether it's windy or not, if you're moving at all, is going to pick up some wind. And so most of the time I'm going to use this windscreen. It's absolutely fantastic little adapter for the camera to prevent you from capturing the wind noise that's just impossible to get rid of. So let's talk about the camera. I'm going to go ahead and power it on. First, we're going to take a look at the menu, and then we'll take a look at some of the actual camera settings. While I'm going to give you a lot in this video, it's definitely not everything that you need to know about the Sony ZV-E10. So if you're really wanting to understand this camera and how to shoot the best photo and video that you can with this camera, you're going to want to check out my Sony ZV Ultimate Guide, which is linked down in the description below. So let's open up the menu and take a look at some of the settings. We know that we're in video mode because we have the video icon in the top left-hand corner, as well as our audio meter right here. Let's go back into the menu, and on the second tab under Movie 1, this is where we can choose our shooting mode, which is also accessible under the function button as well, going down into the bottom right-hand corner. Now, I shoot in full manual mode with my cameras, which might be a little overwhelming to think about because that allows me to control the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO all manually. If you're not ready to do that yet, that is quite okay because there is shutter priority and aperture priority that are great modes as well. And I'll talk a little bit about those, but I talk in great length about those features in my ZV Ultimate Guide. Taking full control over your camera settings is what's going to give you the look and feel out of your image that you're going for. And that might be one of the reasons that you're watching this video. You're wanting a better looking image out of your camera. And you'll get a better looking image out of your camera by understanding how to use the camera settings. Now, this camera has the capability of shooting HD or 4K. I am always going to be shooting 4K with this camera because I want the highest quality and resolution image that I could get out of it. While it's a very capable camera that produces a great image, it is not as capable as bigger high-end cameras. Should I need to crop in on my image a little bit or make some adjustments to it, I want to be working with the best quality image that I can get. So I'm going to be shooting in 4K, and then I'm going to come down to record settings, and I'm going to be shooting in 30p and 100M, which is the highest frame rate and the highest bit rate that this camera will shoot at. Now, I don't necessarily want the highest frame rate just for the sake of having more frames, but being that this camera maxes out at 30 frames per second, I would prefer to have 30 frames than 24 because that gives me a little bit more flexibility with my editing. The higher bit rate gives me a higher quality file, which will give me a little bit more room to work with should I need to correct some colors in my video editor. I always want to be checking my audio levels and making sure that my audio levels are set correct. Whether you're using the internal microphone or you have an external microphone mounted to the camera, be mindful of your audio levels and utilize the headphone jack that this camera has to plug in headphones and listen. A lot of times with a set of headphones on, you can hear things that your camera hears that you wouldn't be able to tell by just looking at the meter on the back of the camera. Now, you definitely want your meter to be bouncing somewhere between -12 and -3, not really going above -3 because that can get really close to 0 dB, which is where your audio starts to clip. When things hit red, that's when your audio is clipping, and audio that's clipping just does not sound good. It's very hard to listen to, especially if it's happening quite often. So be mindful of your audio levels, making sure to check them, making sure to use headphones to monitor them just to be safe. Should you find yourself in a very windy situation where the windscreen is not enough to block the wind noise, we have additional wind noise reduction that we could turn on in the camera. We also have steady shot. Now, this camera has sensor stabilization and some of the lenses have stabilization as well. And then there's also a bit of additional stabilization over the top that is digital that this camera will produce. And so how much do we want? Do we want that to be very active? Do we want standard? Or do we want to shut that off altogether? In most cases, I am going with active because I'm handheld with this camera and I'm moving about, whether I'm shooting a vlog and I'm trying to hold it as still as I can out in front of me, keeping myself framed up. The camera is going to be moving and I want it to minimize as much of that movement as possible. And active stabilization does a pretty good job there. Now, depending on what lens you're shooting with, you might find yourself wanting a little bit of additional zoom range out of a lens. If you're shooting with a prime lens, which is a fixed focal length and you don't have any zoom at all, clear image zoom is a fantastic option because it allows your camera to zoom a little bit beyond its natural capability. So when I start to zoom, you can see here that as I zoom, it's telling me what my focal length is, and then there's a little white bar here. When it jumps up past the white bar, it's showing me that I am in clear image zoom, which means I've zoomed beyond the capabilities of the lens and the camera is doing a little bit of zooming digitally. Clear image zoom means that you can zoom a little bit beyond without losing image quality. This camera also has the ability to go into a digital zoom, which is going to give us a lot more zoom beyond that. But as you probably know, when you do that with your smartphone, when you zoom beyond the lens's capability, your image starts to lose quality. So I only go into this feature when I absolutely need it, but I always have clear image zoom turned on because I know that I can get a little bit more zoom out of my lens without losing image quality. Now, I always turn my grid lines on to the rule of thirds. Now, the reason that I use the rule of thirds is because it helps me frame up my shot and compose my shot better without having to think about it. Whether I'm vlogging and I'm trying to keep my eyes in a specific portion of the screen, using that top line and trying to keep my eyes right across that line helps me from moving the camera around and having my head bounce around in the shot. If I'm shooting something like a landscape, using these lines helps me balance out my image by using the lines to guide where I'll set the horizon or the sky in my shot. The rule of thirds simply helps you balance your shot better. If I'm shooting an interview or I want to position myself to the side, I have the vertical rule of third lines to position myself to one side or position my subject to one side or the other, providing negative space if that's the look that I'm going for. Now, I turn audio signals off simply because I don't like the camera beeping every time I do anything. There's no other option other than on or off, and I'd prefer it to be off. I know that my camera is capturing focus when I press the shutter down and the box lights up or turns green. I don't need a beep to confirm that. And everybody knows the sound of a camera achieving autofocus and it draws attention, and I always prefer to be in sniper mode. Now let's talk about the function menu. The function menu helps you get to camera settings that you need quickly without having to dive through the menu. Most of these items in the function menu I never end up using, but it helps you get to your audio record level really fast without having to go through the menu. It helps you change your focus modes, your focus area, or change your shooting mode without having to dive into the menu. Let's talk about actual camera settings and how to get the best shot. So where do you set your shutter speed? Your shutter speed typically should be 2 times your frame rate. And our frame rate is 30 frames per second. So we would want our shutter speed to be around 1/60th of a second. Now, while I advise you don't go with any slower of a shutter speed than that, you can go with a faster shutter speed, but that tends to make your video appear over sharpened. It takes away from the natural motion blur that we typically see with our eyes. So if at all possible, I try to keep my shutter speed at 2 times the frame rate and not deviate from that. There are situations where you have to, on extremely bright days, where you can't compensate for that with your aperture or even your ISO. So what about aperture? What's a good aperture to shoot with? Well, this particular lens has a variable aperture of f3.5 to 5.6. So that means depending upon where I am zoomed, if I'm zoomed out wide, I can be at an f3.5 aperture. But as I start to zoom in, that aperture is going to change automatically, all the way up to 5.6. So as I zoom in, my actual exposure is going to change a bit because of this lens. Now, there are some lenses that do not have variable apertures. They have a fixed maximum aperture. And those are great lenses, but they typically are a lot more expensive. So if you are shooting with manual settings, it's something to keep in mind that as you zoom in, your exposure is going to change a little bit, and that is a function of a variable aperture on this type of lens. Your aperture not only controls how much light is coming into your camera, but it's also going to control the depth of field as well. A wider aperture is going to let more light in. It's also going to shrink down your depth of field, which helps you separate your subject from your background. Why wouldn't you want to shoot at the widest aperture all the time? Well, it depends. You might need to limit the amount of light that your camera sees to bring the exposure down. If you've ever gone outside and your camera is just completely white screen on the back and you can't see anything, everything is blown out and overexposed. So you may need to bring the aperture down a little bit to let less light into your camera, especially if you're trying to keep your shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. Now, a wide aperture also might have too shallow of a depth of field. You might have separated your subject from the background, but the background might also be so blurry that you can't tell where your subject is. It's important that the viewer of your footage, whatever it is that you're filming, can place the subject in the environment. If the background is way too blurry, they're not going to be able to do that, and it's going to be a little bit distracting. So you want to have a deep enough depth of field to be able to tell where the subject is at while still balancing exposure. It can be kind of tricky. Now, our ISO setting is essentially our sensor's sensitivity, and we can use that to balance out our exposure. We set our ISO by tapping to the right and then rotating and changing our ISO. You can see at a low ISO, things are a bit darker, and as we increase our ISO, things get a bit brighter. And so this is a tool that I use to balance out those other settings. If I want the 1/60th, and I want a wide aperture, and I don't want to use the widest aperture possible to let the most amount of light in, I might need to increase my ISO a little bit to find a proper exposure. How do you know when you have a proper exposure? Well, you have this meter right here, and right now you can see it set at 0.0, which is a balanced out exposure. But as things get a little bit dark, you can see it goes negative, and we don't want it negative because that's underexposed. We also don't want things overexposed. As you can see here, as things start to brighten up a little bit, we start to get a positive number, and we don't want to go too far positive with that because that will overexpose everything as well. So you use these three settings to work together to properly expose an image, which we often refer to the exposure triangle, which is a triangle that is perfectly balanced when an image is perfectly exposed, but making one adjustment to one of those settings will change the shape of the triangle, producing an underexposed or overexposed image. So when you make a change to your shutter speed, you might have to make a change to your aperture. When you make a change to your aperture, you might need to make a change to the ISO to balance things out. But your camera also has shutter and aperture priority modes, which are manual assist modes. For example, shutter priority allows us to set our shutter at 1/60th, and it will stay there while the camera will automatically adjust the aperture and can also automatically adjust the ISO to get us exposure without having to make any manual camera adjustments. Shutter priority is a great option for those of you that are just getting started with wanting to understand manual controls on your camera. Another feature I often use is our focus area. Now, I'll use our focus area large, or sometimes the focus area smaller one, and that allows me to move the focus area around, telling the camera only to focus on the areas that are within that box. This works really well for shooting people because it's often that the camera will see different things going on and it will decide to jump focus to those other things. If you find that happening with your camera often, try this box, because this type of focus setting, which is the focus flexible spot, the flexible spot will stay only on whatever is within that box. And so if I am shooting like a vlog type of video and I want to hold the camera out in front of me and have myself in focus and not have anything behind me accidentally take focus away, the box is what the camera is seeing. And it doesn't stop eye detect autofocus from working. Eye detect autofocus will still continue to work as it is right now. But if eye detect fails, then that box will be the backup, and that box is on my face, and the camera is going to look just to what is in that box to focus on, meaning it's not going to jump to something that's behind me, which potentially could ruin my shot. And of course, you can always override this by tapping to track autofocus on a specific subject. And so tapping, you see I'm tapped on the corner of this keyboard, and it's tracking the corner of that keyboard, autofocusing and changing the autofocus based on keeping the corner of that keyboard nice and focused. And then I tap the center button here to cancel that tracking, and then it just goes right back. And so I'm not losing any features or functionality of my camera. I'm essentially holding my camera accountable and saying only stay focused on things that I want in focus. Don't go looking for things out on the fringe areas of the sensor. Even though the camera can do that, it's often that the camera does go looking and we end up losing autofocus on our subject. So there's so much more that you can learn about your Sony ZV-E10, and that's exactly what I go over in my Sony ZV Ultimate Guide. Check out the course and all of its modules using the link below. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you back in another one soon. Take care.